All right, welcome everyone. We're going to look today at Joseph Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness. Conrad published this work in 1899 at the zenith of the British Empire, and he published it in three installments in a magazine called Blackwoods. Actually, it was an important issue as well because it was the 1000th edition of that magazine, which is a historic publication in the United Kingdom. And it's been wildly popular for ever since it was published, although I think when it was immediately published at the time, it was not as popular as it has become. It's been widely translated into other languages, and in 1998, it was ranked among the top 100 novels written in English in the 20th century. And it will appear on almost every syllabus where English is studied. And I've taught it now for 17 years in my first year English class because I think it's very helpful in illustrating a variety of things. It's a great novel on its own, of course, but it also illustrates certain themes and ideas that I think are important in connecting the course together. And one of them is simply the response to the Enlightenment. That's a topic that came up early on when we looked at Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, and with those things, the association of both of them with the idea of light and the idea of being able to see, the eye being the primary portal for reasoning to take place. And this novella, which is at the height of the Enlightenment, one could say, in terms of the expansion of the European civilized world to the rest of the world through colonialism, Conrad calls his novella The Heart of Darkness, which of course then begs the question, why would he call it this, and why would this be an important description for the novella? And its setting is probably one of the ways of entering into answering that question. It primarily takes place within the Belgian-controlled Congo. And that was right in the center of Africa. If you look at the Congo is right in the jungle there in the Central Africa. And Africa at that time had been colonized by all the European powers. And furthermore, it's important for the reasons of Enlightenment and colonialism that I've suggested, because when Marlowe, as a young man, he says as a young chap, he had a passion for maps. And at the time when he was younger, mid-19th century it would be, when he looked at there were many blank spaces on the earth, and one that looked particularly inviting was right in the middle of where the Congo now is. And so this blank space is one that he wished to enter, to explore, and to some degree then to master. Which I think is an interesting idea, but it fits in with the idea of it being a place of darkness, in the sense that it had not yet been enlightened, it had not yet been mapped, it had not yet been understood by the Enlightenment mindset. And so in that sense, the darkness is a place that's not yet been brought under the control of the enlightened mind. But I think darkness is more important than that, and it's an important motif in the whole novella. I mean, the title itself gives it away, but it's also the whole mood for the novella is shrouded in darkness. So, and that seems to be pervasive as well. It's not just that it's dark in Africa, dark in the jungle where the light doesn't penetrate, but also England and Brussels, the three places that are the setting for the novella, are all described as gloomy. and dark in some ways, even when the light is shining brightly. And so darkness seems to have a metaphorical meaning, and not just a literal description, as you might think if it were describing the jungle in the Congo where the light doesn't penetrate. Darkness is, and this is an important connotation, I think. Darkness is the absence of light. It's not the opposite of light per se, but it's the absence of light. It's the deprivation of light. It's when you, and without light one cannot see. And if we're going to further then apply that and consider darkness as the absence of light, or the privation of light, or the deprivation of light, then if you're reflecting upon it as a description of Africa, Brussels, England, and to some degree human nature, then he's making to some degree a much broader and richer commentary than simply one of physical description. He seems to me to be talking about human nature and the depravity of human nature, and that's an all-pervasive thing. And that's my take on the Heart of Darkness, and why I find it particularly interesting is because I don't simply see it the way many critics do, as a colonialist text. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. That's part of its reception. It's part of the problematic reception of it, to my mind. The critical reception is that it is seen as a colonialist text because of the context in which it's written, and because it describes the colonizing powers. And some, such as the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, has described it precisely as a racist text. And I quote, "It is an offensive and deplorable book because it dehumanizes the Africans." And he says that Conrad was blinkered by his xenophobia, and presented Africa as the other, to use the theoretical languages of the 20th century. There's the self and the other, the European self on the one hand, and the African other on the other. So the Africans had no identity of their own. They were the privation of having identity in that sense. Now, I think this is a misreading of the text myself, and I think that it ignores the fact that Heart of Darkness seems, to my mind, to be highly critical of colonialism. His portrait of the Belgians is nothing like flattering, and even his portrait of the British, although it's more flattering, is not without its contradictions, because he begins the whole novella by stating of Britain that this also, and this is his protagonist, Marlowe, has been one of the dark places of the earth. This being London and the Thames River running through it. And so it seems to me that far from being merely a colonialist text, or a post-colonialist text as the critical tradition has received it, it's a far more profound existential exploration of the problem of evil and the pervasiveness of evil. And with that in mind, my answer to the question of what is the heart of darkness is probably connected with that. It's connected with the idea that evil is not something that you can identify visibly. It's something that is seen as the privation of something that you see. It's presented in the form of shadows. And so many of Marlowe's protagonists gain information by overhearing conversations, and they often are eavesdropping. So they're not directly, they're indirectly perceiving and understanding things. And this is also presented in the form of interiors and exteriors. So the Marlowe wants to see beneath the surface of things because he thinks that the visible exterior of things hide the true nature of the thing. And so there's this persistent emphasis on needing to get below the surface of things in order to see the true nature of it. And so that is how I'd like to begin this discussion of Heart of Darkness. I think it needs to be seen as a more of a theological or philosophical meditation on what the Heart of Darkness is, rather than associating it with a particular people. Having said all that, I think that one of the reasons that it has been received as a colonialist text, or a post-colonialist text, if you will, depending on what vantage point one sees it here, is because that is the context for the late 19th century. The late 19th century and the 20th century are times when there's no doubt that racist ideologies are being strongly held to and are being acted upon furthermore, and by the European powers. And this is largely because of the influence of Darwinism, because Darwinism looks at the human being as having it's a species, first of all, and he talks about creatures in terms of species, and he identifies them in accordance with their natural characteristics. So he disputes the fact that mankind has a different nature than the other animals. They're contiguous with that. They evolved from that. And then if that is the case, then it suggests that there might actually be differences between those whom we term human beings. And it further leads to the suggestion that if the evolution of the species happens through natural selection, and the fittest are those that survive, then the question that is being begged is that of all of the human beings that populate the planet and all their different nations and appearances and so-called races, which one of them is the most fit to survive? And to some degree, with that backdrop in mind, colonialism takes place. Not only as a monetary or a material attempt to enrich their countries, although there's most certainly is there, and that's one of the things that Conrad is eager to critique, I think, but also in the sense that all of the European powers are rushing to colonize the world in order to demonstrate that they are the fittest, that they are the most advanced civilizations. And that's not only against the Africans or the South Americans or the Asians or whatever you will have it, it's also amongst themselves. Which of the European powers is the most advanced and which will demonstrate that it is fit to survive? And so there's a rush in the late 19th century and the early century leading up to the First World War of a national agenda on every European plate to demonstrate that they are in fact the master race, which becomes even more prominent in the Second World War. But I think you can already see it here in the leading up to the First World War. And so with that in mind, I think Conrad is saying something far, far more profound than about the inferiority of the Black Africans. In fact, I don't even see that in the novella particularly myself. So with that said, let me come to look at this story. I should say something about it. I think I said it was in the published in 1899. But I should say something about Conrad's own biography, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, namely that he was born in Poland, which I find quite extraordinary because it's such a well-written novel, although some of the phrases are a little bit funny in some ways, as F.R. Leavis has observed, the British critic. But it's extraordinarily well connected and written, and is powerful in its depictions. And he's writing not only in a second language, but actually a third language, because although he was Polish, he spoke French as a second language and then English as a third. But in terms of his own autobiography, Conrad himself served as a sailor and spent much of his life, in fact, on boats, doing the very things that his protagonist, Marlowe, does himself. So in 1890, when he was 32 years of age, Conrad himself served on a Belgian steamer and sailed up the Congo. And even more interestingly, the captain of that steamer fell ill, and Conrad himself served as the captain for a time. So that's 9 years before he publishes this work. And I think you can see, although I wouldn't say that the stories are autobiographical in any way, you can see a sense of his affinity to the life of the seaman and the life of adventure, and yet is also his awareness of some of the troubling moral implications of that. So with that said, why don't I come to read some of the novella, some of the things that I think are worth mentioning right at the outset, and we'll get those by setting the stage here. So I talked about light and darkness. We can see that right at the outset here, where he is, and he begins on the Thames River on a cruiser with a company of 4 other men, and he is telling the story about a man by the name of Marlowe, who's sitting with them on the ship. And they're sitting in, as I say, on the river at the turning of the tide, so they're not able to sail out because the tide is coming in, and they can't go against the tide because it's simply too powerful. So let me begin with the opening lines. The Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made. The wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. The sea reach of the Thames stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint, and in the luminous space, the tan sails of the barges drifting up with the tide seemed to stand still in red clusters of canvas sharply peaked, with gleams of varnished spirits. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and the greatest town on earth. The director of companies was our captain and our host. We 4 affectionately watched his back as he stood in the bows looking to seaward. On the whole river there was nothing that looked half so nautical. He resembled a pilot, which to a seaman is trustworthiness personified. It was difficult to realize his work was not out there in the luminous estuary, but behind him within the brooding gloom. So note the reference to the light being out there and the dark being behind him. Although London will be portrayed as a place of civilization and enlightenment, nonetheless, Conrad immediately casts it in as a shadowy place. And by shadowy, again, I want to suggest the metaphysical connotation of a place that is deprived of good. I'm using the Augustinian notion of evil here. St. Augustine said that evil is something that does not exist unto itself, but rather is the absence of existence, or the absence of goodness. So it's a privation thereby. And I think Conrad has that theological sense when he portrays darkness, and it pervades the whole novella. Back to the text. Between us, there was, as I've already said somewhere, the bond of the sea. Besides holding our hearts together through long periods of separation, it had the effect of making us tolerant of each other's yarns and even convictions. The lawyer, the best of old fellows, had, because of his many years and many virtues, the only cushion on deck, and was lying on the only rug. The accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes and was toying architecturally with the bones. Marlowe sat cross-legged, right aft, leaning against the mizzenmast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outwards, resembled an idol. The director, satisfied the anchor had good hold, made his way aft and sat down amongst us. We exchanged a few words lazily. Afterwards, there was silence on board the yacht. For some reason or other, we did not begin that game of dominoes. We felt meditative and fit for nothing but placid staring. The day was ending in a serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. The water shone pacifically. The sky, without a speck, was a benign immensity of unstained light. The very mist on the Essex March was like a gauzy and radiant fabric, hung from the wooded rises inland and draping the low shores in diaphanous folds. Only the gloom to the west, brooding over the upper reaches, became more somber every minute, as if angered by the approach of the sun. So the depiction of the light that is falling in diaphanous folds, it's all, to my mind, the portrait of the light to the east and the dark to the west. The dark to the west being the civilized center of the known world at the time, whereas the light to the east, representing the world outside of Britain, is already casting doubt on what some critics see as a too favorable portrait of the British Empire. I think he's already suggesting, just simply by his description of the landscape here, something rather to the contrary. But back to the text. And at last, in its curved and imperceptible fall, the sun sank low, and from glowing white changed to a dull red, without rays and without heat, as if about to go out suddenly, stricken to death by the touch of that gloom brooding over a crowd of men. I'll skip a few lines here. And he says, I'll read on. Forthwith a change came over the waters, and the serenity became less brilliant, but more profound. The old river in its broad reach rested unruffled at the decline of day. After ages of good service done to the race that peopled its banks, spread out in the tranquil dignity of a waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth. We looked at the venerable stream, not in the vivid flush of a short day that comes and departs forever, but in the august light of abiding memories. And indeed, nothing is easier for a man who has, as the phrase goes, followed the sea with reverence and affection than to evoke the great spirit of the past upon the lower reaches of the Thames. The tidal current runs to and fro in its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships it has borne to the rest of home or to the battles of the sea. It had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights all, titled and untitled, the great knights errant of the sea. It had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time, from the Golden Hind, returning with her rotund flanks full of treasure to be visited by the Queen's Highness, and thus pass out of the gigantic tale, to the Erebus and Terror, bound on other conquests, and that never returned. It had known the ships and the men. They had sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith, the adventurers and the settlers, king's ships and the ships of men on change, captain, admirals, the dark interlopers of the Eastern trade, and the commissioned generals of the East India fleets. Hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires. The sun set. The dusk fell on the stream, and lights began to appear along the shore. The Chapman Lighthouse, a three-legged thing erect on a mudflat, shone strongly. Lights of ships moved in the fairway, a great stir of lights going up and going down. And further west on the upper reaches, the place of the monstrous town was still marked ominously on the sky. A brooding gloom in sunshine, a lurid glare under the stars. And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. Now, as I said to you here, this depiction and its conclusion with Marlowe's pronouncement. Remember, Marlowe sitting here with his palms upwards on his lap, sitting, as he's described elsewhere in the text, like a Buddha. And the Buddha, an introverted figure looking within himself. If you see the portraits of the Buddha, his eyes are turned inwards. He's contemplating himself, navel gazing, as it were. The portrait of Eastern wisdom is what Marlowe is bringing to this text, a very non-Western way of looking at things, seeing things not with the eyes of the rest of the company, but with the experience of voyaging on the sea. So he's not operating within the echo chamber of the imperial powers. He's a different sort of fellow. And I think that's an important observation to make right at the outset. And then he continues on with that to make it clear, if it weren't before, that he's being critical of even England. As much as he admires it, he's also critical. And so he goes on and says, I was thinking of very old times, when the Romans first came here, 1900 years ago, the other day. Light came out of this river since. You say nights? Yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. Imagine the feelings of a commander of a fine, what do you call him? Trireme in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north, run overland across the Gauls in a hurry, put in charge of one of those craft, the legionaries, a wonderful lot of handy men they must have been too, used to build, apparently by the hundred, in a month or two, if we may believe what we read. Imagine him here, the very end of the world, or what you like. Sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages. Precious little to eat, fit for a civilized man. Nothing but Thames water to drink. No Falernian wine here. No going ashore. Here and there a military camp lost in a wilderness like a needle in a bundle of hay. Cold, fog, tempests, disease, exile, and death. Death skulking in the air, in the water, in the bush. They must have been dying like flies here. Oh, yes, he did it. Did it very well, too, no doubt, and without thinking much about it either, except afterwards to brag of what he'd gone through in his time, perhaps. They were men enough to face the darkness. And perhaps he was cheered by keeping his eye on a chance of promotion to the fleet at Ravenna. By and by, if he had good friends in Rome and survived the awful climate, or think of a young decent citizen in a toga, perhaps too much dice, coming out here in the train of some prefect, or tax gatherer, or trader even, to mend his fortunes, land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post, feel the savagery, the utter savagery had closed around him. All that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forests, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. And it has a fascination, too, that goes to work upon him. The fascination of the abomination. You know, imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerful disgust, the surrender, the hate. Mind, he began. None of us would feel exactly like this. What saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency. But these chaps were not much account, really. They were no colonialists. Their administration was merely a squeeze, and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that, you want only brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a grand scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to you. So what Marlowe is commenting on here, and he's already reflecting, and he's also anticipating the tale that he's about to tell us, which is of his voyages to the Congo, where he talks about those with flatter noses and so forth. He's not talking about the British, he's talking about the Congolese there. And he's talking about how Britain, the place that is now the center of civilization from which they are being sent out, and going to the Congo, being metaphorically comparable to being sent in the old age of the Roman Empire to the utter reaches of their empire to Britain. So he's drawing the analogy there. But he says something that's really interesting and important there. He says that it is what saves us is efficiency. And by efficiency, he's reflecting on something that differentiates colonialism of this day from the mere conquest of the past. And that is the full-scale commitment to dominion and domination of life. And this is where I think that men like Chinua Achebe and other critics have something right. It's not the racism per se, it's the dehumanization that takes place under the guise of the Enlightenment. And this is a theme we've already seen. Again, in Swift's Modest Proposal, I mentioned Frankenstein in an earlier lecture, although we haven't read it. But we could also have seen it in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This commitment to Francis Bacon's idea of nature as something to be to gain power over, and now the nature to be gained power over is that of human nature. And so Marlowe is giving voice to probably a concern that it seems to me, from reading a fair bit of Conrad, is of concern to the author as well. This idea that there's something distinctive about modernity that makes the heart of darkness that much more troubling, and that is the gain of power for the sake of power and a full-scale commitment to it. So it's not just, as he says, grabbing and taking and plundering, it's controlling and dominating and dehumanizing those that are conquered, but also those who are doing the conquering. And that is the thing that he most portrays most clearly and most profoundly in this little novella. It's the heart of darkness, which isn't just in the Congolese, but more particularly in the most civilized people. Those who are exercising the dominion are themselves the ones whose hearts are most dark, and yet they are cased in whitewashed sepulchres. So finish off with that for now, and then I'll make another comment on Heart of Darkness shortly from now.